Chapter 1, Captain Ethan Stone. Parker stood motionless in the command deck of Argo, his eyes fixed on the swirling darkness outside. The hum of the station's systems was a constant presence, but it couldn't drown out the pounding of his own heartbeat. His thoughts were consumed by the impending doom that loomed over humanity. The Zalorh fleet was closing in, an unstoppable wave of destruction. Inside Argo, the last remnants of humanity clung to survival. But with each passing hour, the hope of turning the tide seemed more and more distant. "Captain," a voice broke through his reverie, pulling him back to the present. "They're here. The Zalorh are within range." It was Lieutenant Sarah Carver, his first officer and the one person he could rely on in the darkest of times. She was standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Despite the grim situation, she stood tall, her sharp eyes betraying only the slightest trace of uncertainty. The rest of the crew could only be as strong as their leader, and Ethan had always prided himself on never showing weakness. He nodded slowly, pushing the knot in his stomach aside. "I know, Sarah. We got a few hours, maybe less." He turned to face her fully, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We need to act now." Carver stepped forward, her boots clicking against the cold metal floor. She handed him a data pad, its screen illuminated with the latest intel. The Zalorh were closer than ever. The planet-killer weapon they had developed was a reality. If they didn't make a move, humanity would be wiped out for good. "These bastards think they've won," she muttered, her fingers tightening on the pad. "But they haven't seen what humans can do when we're backed into a corner." Ethan glanced down at the screen, studying the map of the Zalorh fleet. There were thousands of ships, each larger and more advanced than anything the humans had ever built. The odds were staggering, but in his gut, he knew they still had one thing that no alien race could replicate: human will. "We don't have the firepower to take them on directly," Ethan said, shaking his head. "We've already lost most of our fleet. What we have left can barely defend Argo. But there's another way." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Another way? What do you have in mind?" Ethan exhaled slowly, locking eyes with her. "A suicide mission." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Carver's face betrayed nothing, but Ethan knew her well enough to see the flicker of hesitation behind her eyes. This wasn't something she wanted to hear, not when they were all on the brink of extinction. But she trusted him, trusted his judgment more than anyone else. "We can't win this war with the fleet we have left," Ethan continued, his voice steady. "But if we infiltrate their flagship, Zalorh, we could destroy their planet-killer weapon. It's the only shot we have." The room was still. The idea was risky, bordering on insane. A handful of humans against the might of the Zalorh Empire. No backup, no reinforcements. Yet Ethan's resolve remained unshaken. There was no other choice. Earth's last hope lay in this desperate gamble. Carver nodded after a long pause, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I'm in, but you know the risks. We're talking about a one-way trip here." Ethan didn't flinch. "I know, but it's the only way." He turned his gaze back to the screen, staring at the fleet's movement, a cold, calculated line forming in his mind. Time was slipping away, and they had no more room to waste. The crew of Argo had survived the first wave of the Zalorh invasion, but that had come at an immense cost. Entire colonies had been destroyed, their people lost. The war had dragged on for nearly 2 decades, and humanity's resources were nearly depleted. Yet, despite the odds, the resistance had not crumbled. It had not given up. "We have to move quickly," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "The Zalorh are smarter than we think. If we wait too long, they'll find us." A series of low murmurs rippled through the command deck as the crew processed the plan. Ethan wasn't surprised by the silence. This was no ordinary mission. It was the kind of mission that separated the brave from the foolish. Lieutenant Carver stepped forward, her voice low but unwavering. "What's the plan, sir?" "We'll use Pride of Earth, a stealth-class ship. We're going to infiltrate their defenses and get inside Zalorh," Ethan explained, tapping a few buttons on the console in front of him. A 3D hologram of the Zalorh flagship materialized, showing the ship's layout. It was massive, nearly 3 times the size of Argo, brimming with weapons and security systems. We'll disable their primary weapon, the one that's capable of wiping out Earth's colonies. If we can destroy it, we stand a chance of surviving. Ow! Carver asked, her tone tinged with skepticism. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. We'll need to get close, inside their maintenance bays, where their security is weakest. Once we're in, we'll plant explosives in the heart of their weapon system and escape before they realize what hit them. Carver's eyes narrowed as she processed the information. And if we don't make it out, we won't think about that. Not yet, Ethan replied, his voice resolute. We fight until the end. Carver didn't respond right away. She turned back to the command station, her fingers flying over the controls. I'll prepare the crew. We've got one shot at this, and we need everyone focused. Ethan took a deep breath, letting the weight of the decision sink in. There was no turning back now. If they failed, Earth would be lost. But if they succeeded, if they could somehow destroy the weapon, they might have a fighting chance. The thought of humanity standing tall against the Zalorh Empire, against all odds, kept him going. It was the one thing that had always kept him alive. He watched as the crew began to prepare for the mission, each one stepping up despite the uncertainty. They were afraid, but they would do this. They had no choice. Let's do this, Ethan murmured, to no one in particular. The mission had begun. Chapter 2, The Darkness of Space, stretched infinitely before them, as the Pride of Earth slipped silently through the shadows of the Zalorh fleet. The small, stealth-class ship was humanity's last hope. On board, the air was thick with tension. Every crew member knew the odds. They were moving into enemy territory, and if they didn't succeed, Earth would be no more than a distant memory. Ethan Parker stood at the helm, his hands gripping the controls with precision. He was used to command, but this was different. The weight of the mission felt heavier than ever. His crew, all volunteers, were about to face their mortality, knowing full well that there was no escape if things went wrong. We're approaching the Zalorh perimeter. Carver's voice cut through the silence, calm but laced with urgency. She stood behind him, monitoring the ship's systems. We've got 10 minutes until they'll detect us if we don't disable their scanners. Ethan didn't look back, his focus unyielding. Get to work, Lieutenant. Carver's fingers flew over the controls, and the low hum of the ship's engines suddenly quieted. The cloaking system flickered, its energy consuming the last of the ship's reserves. The ship was now invisible to the Zalorh sensors, but it wouldn't hold for long. The Zalorh ships were enormous, far larger than anything humanity had built, and they were equipped with technology designed to find even the most subtle traces of human activity. Their sensors are still scanning, Carver reported, her voice strained. We're close. I need another minute to complete the bypass. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, his jaw tight. We don't have a minute. Do it now. Carver didn't hesitate. She initiated the override, her fingers tapping a series of keys. The air in the cockpit was heavy with silence as the crew braced themselves. The seconds felt like hours. If they were caught now, there was no chance of making it inside Zalorh. Suddenly, the soft chime of a successful connection echoed through the room. Carver let out a relieved breath. We're clear. The scanners are down. Ethan let his breath out slowly, his shoulders loosening slightly. Good. Set course for Zalorh. The ship lurched as it adjusted its trajectory, the smooth hum of the engines now carrying them deeper into enemy territory. Ethan couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not yet. Every move was critical. The Zalorh fleet loomed large in their path, vast and impenetrable, their sleek designs a testament to their superiority. How long until we reach the flagship? Ethan asked, his gaze still fixed on the path ahead. 30 minutes, if we don't get detected, Carver replied, her fingers working furiously as she monitored the ship's power levels. We'll need to dock in their maintenance bay. That's our best chance at getting in unnoticed. And once we're in, Ethan's voice was calm, but his mind raced. The thought of breaking into the heart of Zalorh power was daunting, but failure was not an option. If they couldn't destroy the weapon, humanity would be wiped out. Once we're inside, Carver said, not looking up, we disable their security and make our way to the core. From there, we plant the charges and escape before they even know what hit them. Ethan nodded, his thoughts focused. The plan was risky, but it was their only chance. What about the crew? We've got a skeleton crew, Carver replied. The rest are ready to defend the ship if we get caught, but it's a one-way ticket if we do. We're all in this together. Ethan knew that. Each person on board was risking everything. They were outnumbered, underprepared, and facing an enemy with superior technology. But they had one thing the Zalorh would never understand: the human will to survive, to fight, even when there was no hope. Keep it steady, Ethan said to Carver, then turned to his team in the back. Get ready. This is it. No turning back now. The crew, a mix of engineers, soldiers, and tech specialists, were already preparing their gear. Each of them understood the gravity of the situation. The ship's cargo hold, now transformed into a makeshift armory, hummed with quiet activity. Sam Cole, the chief engineer, was calibrating the explosive charges that would disable the Zalorh weapon. His hands were steady, but his eyes showed the fatigue of years of war. How's the explosive setup? Ethan asked, walking over to Sam. Ready as I'll ever be, Sam replied, his voice dry. If this works, it's going to take down their whole central system. If not, well, we've already made history. Ethan clapped him on the shoulder. We'll make it work. We don't have a choice. Sam nodded, but didn't say anything else. His eyes spoke volumes. They had all lost something in this war. Earth had become a place of memories and rubble, and there were only remnants of the lives they once knew. But this was their shot at redemption. As they neared Zalorh, the sheer size of the Zalorh flagship became apparent. The ship was an absolute behemoth, its hull a mixture of sleek, alien alloys that shimmered under the dim light of distant stars. It was a fortress in space, a symbol of the Zalorh Empire's dominance. Approaching Zalorh, Carver said, her voice tight with the knowledge of what was to come. I'm initiating the docking sequence. The crew fell into a tense silence as they neared the massive bay doors of the enemy ship. The docking procedure would have to be flawless. A mistake now would trigger alarms and ruin everything. Ethan's hands were steady, his mind razor-sharp. He couldn't afford to falter, not when so much was at stake. The pride of Earth shuddered as it made contact with the docking bay of Zalorh. For a moment, the crew held their breath, the tension palpable. If the Zalorh sensors hadn't detected them yet, they were in. Docking complete, Carver said. We're in. Ethan stood. Move out. Stay quiet. We don't know what kind of resistance we'll face once we're inside. As the crew filed out, Ethan led them down the darkened corridors of Zalorh, the unfamiliarity of the ship making every footstep feel louder than it was. The air smelled strange, thick with the metallic scent of alien machinery. The quiet hum of the ship's power systems was the only sound that filled the air. The crew moved cautiously, weapons ready, but kept low. Every shadow felt like an ambush waiting to happen. The plan had been to reach the heart of the Zalorh warship without alerting anyone. But even with their stealth systems, the ship was still a fortress. Every step felt like a countdown to disaster. As they moved deeper into the bowels of Zalorh, Ethan's mind raced. The mission seemed to stretch on forever, each new hallway and corridor presenting new challenges. They hadn't encountered any enemies yet, but the silence of the ship was deafening. Where's the weapon? Sam asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ethan pointed ahead, towards a set of heavy doors. Through there. Once we plant the charges, we make our way back to the ship. Fast. As they neared the door, a warning klaxon suddenly blared throughout the ship. The sound was piercing, echoing off the metal walls. Shit. We've been spotted, Carver hissed. Ethan cursed under his breath. Move. Now. Chapter 3. The alarm screeched to life, piercing the silence of the Zalorh flagship. The red lights flashing overhead seemed to ignite something primal in Ethan's chest, a rush of adrenaline that made everything sharper, more urgent. The cold, calculated plan was no longer the center of their reality. The mission had become a race, a desperate scramble against time and the overwhelming force that was now aware of their presence. Move! Move! Ethan barked, his voice hoarse with command. He turned and bolted down the narrow corridor, the echo of his boots muffled by the thick, alien metal floor. Behind him, the rest of the team followed, their faces etched with the same grim resolve. It was a blur of movement, fists slamming against walls for support, eyes darting to the flashing red emergency lights above them, but no one faltered. Carver was at his side, eyes locked forward. "We've got to split up," she said, her voice quick and low. "We won't make it if we stay in one group. We'll be too easy a target." Ethan nodded sharply. "Sam, you and the others find that weapon and destroy it. Carver and I will draw them away. We can't afford to waste any more time." Sam glanced up from the device in his hands, already scanning the corridor ahead. "Understood," he said, without hesitation. His fingers tightened around the explosive charges. "Be safe." With a silent exchange, Sam and his group veered off to the right, heading towards the massive doors that concealed the Zalorh weapon. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest, and yet there was no time to second-guess. Carver's steady presence beside him helped clear his mind, keeping his focus sharp. They rounded a corner, and the first wave of Zalorh soldiers emerged from the darkened halls ahead. Tall, armored figures with sharp, angular features and glowing red eyes. The alien soldiers moved like a coordinated machine, weaponized and relentless, their heavy footsteps vibrating through the floor beneath them. "Stay low," Ethan hissed, his hand signaling Carver to duck behind a bulkhead. A moment later, they were crouching in the shadows, weapons drawn. The first of the Zalorh soldiers passed, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his body tensing like a coiled spring. But they hadn't been spotted yet. He silently counted the seconds, his mind calculating their next move. Carver's breathing was steady beside him, though her eyes were alert, scanning the approaching line of enemies. Once the last soldier moved past, Ethan signaled for them to move. Quiet as shadows, they sprinted down another hallway, pushing forward with a mix of urgency and quiet desperation. They couldn't afford to waste any time. The entire ship was on alert now, and every second they lingered could mean discovery. They approached the next set of doors, massive, segmented slabs of metal, pulsating with energy from within. The weapon, the heart of the Zalorh Empire's ultimate weapon, lay beyond them. But as they got closer, the air thickened. Ethan's instincts flared. Something wasn't right. The doors slid open with an eerie hiss, revealing a stark, empty chamber. There were no guards, no defense systems in sight. Nothing but an ominous hum that seemed to fill the room with a suffocating presence. A single console sat at the center, surrounded by cables and alien technology. "Where the hell are they?" Ethan muttered, his voice low. Carver surveyed the room, eyes narrowing. "It's too quiet. This doesn't feel right." Before Ethan could respond, a metallic screech split the silence. A shiver ran down his spine as the room suddenly flooded with light. Massive screens activated along the walls, casting eerie blue light on the console at the center. A voice boomed through the speakers, deep, chilling, and unmistakably alien. "Humans, you are foolish to think you can defeat us. Your resistance has been amusing, but it ends now." Ethan's blood ran cold. "It's a trap," he hissed. Suddenly, a series of mechanical shutters dropped from the ceiling, enclosing the room in a circular cage. From the walls, robotic arms shot out, brandishing weapons, force fields, plasma cannons, and deadly energy blades. The air crackled with electric tension as the room came alive with the lethal hum of alien technology. Ethan's mind raced. The mission was slipping from their grasp. They needed that weapon disabled now. He pulled Carver close. "We're not leaving until that thing's destroyed," he said, voice tight with determination. "You keep the right side. I'll cover the left." Without waiting for confirmation, he moved forward, his pulse pounding in his ears. As his footfalls echoed through the chamber, the robotic arms fired, but Ethan was faster. He dove to the side, rolling beneath a shot that scorched the air above him. He barely came to his feet before another wave of plasma shot out. His weapon roared to life, its rounds striking the mechanical arms with brutal precision. One by one, the robotic arms fell, sparking and sizzling as their power circuits were destroyed. Carver, he shouted. We're almost there. She was already ahead, moving with deadly grace, taking out another robotic arm with a well-aimed shot. She pressed forward, her voice steady despite the chaos. I've got the secondary systems covered. You focus on the core. Ethan nodded sharply, making his way toward the central console. It was a tangle of alien circuits, wires, and glowing energy conduits. The weapon was there, its core pulsating with the power to wipe out entire worlds. His fingers moved quickly, grabbing at the explosive charges strapped to his chest. Sam, how much longer? Ethan grunted as he set the charges on the console. Almost there. Sam's voice crackled through the comm. Prepare for extraction. Ethan gritted his teeth. His hands moved with surgical precision, threading the wires into the device. The countdown had begun. The hum of the weapon, the whir of the robotic arms, it all seemed to blend into a low, threatening sound. He could feel the heat of the Zalorh weapon building, threatening to explode in all its destructive power. As he finished wiring the final charge, the chamber around him seemed to vibrate with the energy of the Zalorh technology. A sudden blinding light filled the room, and Ethan barely had time to react. Move! Carver shouted, pulling him toward the exit. The door slid open just as the room began to tremble. The explosion was imminent. They ran, their bodies instinctively dodging fire as they made their way back through the now chaotic corridors. Ethan's breath came in sharp gasps, his body aching from the adrenaline that surged through him. Behind them, the Zalorh weapon began to hum louder, its energy unstable as it buckled under the weight of the charges they had set. It was now or never. Chapter for the explosion was deafening, a shockwave that rattled the very foundation of Zalorh. The air vibrated with the power of the blast, and the walls groaned, as if the ship itself were in pain. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline surging as the entire ship seemed to tremble beneath his feet. He didn't have to look back to know what was happening. The weapon was gone, obliterated, leaving only the searing heat of destruction in its wake. Move! Now! Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse as he grabbed Carver's arm, pulling her toward the exit. The moment they'd been waiting for had arrived, but the price of success was always steep. The hallways of Zalorh were no longer silent. Alarms blared through the entire ship, and the rhythmic pounding of boots echoed in the distance. Zalorh soldiers rushing to contain the damage. Their footsteps grew louder with every passing second, a relentless reminder that time was running out. We need to get back to the ship now, Carver yelled, her voice tinged with urgency. She was already ahead of him, moving quickly through the maze of alien corridors, eyes scanning the dark spaces for any sign of enemy movement. Her hand was on her weapon, ready to fire at anything that moved. They didn't have to wait long. A group of Zalorh soldiers rounded the corner, their glowing red eyes scanning the darkness. Their weapons hummed with lethal energy, each one more dangerous than the last. There was no time to think, no time for hesitation. The moment of truth had arrived. Fire! Ethan shouted. The sound of gunfire rang through the corridor as they both opened fire, their weapons synchronized. Ethan's shots found their marks, but the Zalorh soldiers kept coming, their thick armor absorbing most of the rounds. Ethan could see the terror in their eyes. These weren't just soldiers. They were part of an empire that had never been challenged before. And now, they were fighting for survival. Move! Ethan ordered again, pulling Carver forward, away from the fight. They couldn't afford to stay and face a battle they couldn't win. Carver ducked low, her body moving fluidly, dodging shots as she sprinted ahead. Ethan stayed close behind her, his eyes on the hallway ahead. The blast had made their escape route almost too easy. Too many soldiers had been deployed in the aftermath, leaving the halls unguarded. As they turned another corner, the ship shuddered again, the tremors stronger this time. The countdown to destruction was beginning. It was now or never. We need to get back to the Pride, Carver said, her voice tense, glancing over her shoulder. If we don't leave soon, we will, Ethan interrupted, cutting off her sentence. We make it back no matter what. That weapon's destroyed. We've done what we came here to do. His words were almost a comfort, but they both knew that the hardest part of the mission was yet to come. They had destroyed the weapon, but the Zalorh weren't going to let them leave without a fight. The ship was alive with activity, and as the seconds ticked by, every footstep, every flicker of light, sent a fresh wave of urgency coursing through Ethan's veins. "Ethan!" Carver shouted, pointing ahead. "Look out!" A group of Zalorh soldiers appeared from the shadows, weapons raised, their faces hardened with rage. This time, they were prepared. The hallway ahead was blocked, their escape routes narrowing with every passing second. "Stay calm," Ethan shouted, his voice steady despite the growing chaos. His heart rate had spiked, but his mind was clear. The battle wasn't over yet. "We'll fight our way out." Carver nodded, and together, they took cover behind the nearest wall. Ethan's mind worked in overdrive, quickly analyzing the situation. They couldn't fight their way through the entire force, not with the numbers they had now. They needed a distraction, a way to get past the Zalorh soldiers and reach the Pride of Earth before the ship collapsed under the weight of the damage. "Sam, status!" Ethan shouted into his comms, hoping against hope that his engineer could come through at the last moment. "Almost there," Sam's voice crackled in reply, strained but determined. "Just hold tight. I've almost triggered the escape sequence. You've got 2 minutes before the Zalorh know what's hit them." 2 minutes, Ethan repeated, his pulse quickening. They didn't have 2 minutes. What was their best shot? "On my mark," Ethan said, his voice low. "We break through the left flank. Carver, take point." Carver nodded, her eyes already scanning the soldiers ahead, calculating their next move. "Ready when you are." Ethan held his breath. The seconds felt like hours. His entire body was taut with anticipation, waiting for that critical moment when they would either escape or die trying. "Now!" Ethan shouted. In an instant, Carver burst from her position, her gun raised and firing, sending the Zalorh soldiers scattering for cover. Ethan followed close behind, firing off shots as they moved. The exchange of gunfire was chaotic, but they had the upper hand. They were fighting for their lives, and they wouldn't stop until they had the freedom to escape. Ethan ducked as a plasma shot flew past him, barely missing. He returned fire, striking down one of the Zalorh soldiers who had tried to flank them. Carver moved with deadly precision, clearing a path for them to advance. They kept moving, faster now, toward the airlock that would take them back to Pride of Earth. The tremors grew stronger with each passing second, the countdown now just seconds away. "We're almost there," Carver shouted, her voice strained with effort. She was already ahead, her gun blazing a path through the remaining soldiers. Ethan didn't look back. He could feel the pull of the Pride calling to him, the only sanctuary left for humanity. They had been fighting for this moment for so long, fighting for the survival of Earth, fighting for everything they'd lost. As they reached the airlock, Ethan's hand slammed the emergency override, and the doors opened with a hiss. The ship was just a few meters away, the Pride a silhouette looming in the distance. "We made it," Carver shouted, her voice filled with relief. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. The Zalorh forces were closing in, their heavy footsteps reverberating through the hallway. There wasn't enough time. The Pride was already preparing for launch, but they had to get to the airlock. "Ethan, go!" Carver shouted, shoving him toward the ship. "I'll cover you." Ethan hesitated for only a second before he turned and sprinted toward the airlock. He could hear the blast of Carver's weapon behind him as she held the enemy off. He could feel the heat of the impending explosion, but he pushed forward, not stopping until he was safely aboard the Pride. The airlock closed behind him with a soft hiss. He didn't look back. "Sam, get us out of here," Ethan said, his voice steady as the last tremors of the Zalorh flagship echoed through the ship. "We're gone," Sam replied, his voice clear with a quiet triumph. The ship lurched as the engines roared to life. The Pride of Earth was leaving the heart of Zalorh territory, and for the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself a breath of relief. Chapter 5. The Pride of Earth shot through the remnants of the Zalorh fleet, the ship's engines blazing with the force of their escape. Ethan Parker stood at the command station, watching as the vast expanse of space stretched out before him. His heart, still pounding from the chaos, now settled into a rhythm that matched the hum of the ship. The mission had succeeded. They had destroyed the Zalorh weapon, dealt a devastating blow to their empire, and escaped the heart of their stronghold. Yet, as the stars streaked past, a heavy silence hung in the air. The explosion from Zalorh had been massive, sending shockwaves through the galaxy. The Zalorh flagship had crumbled, and with it, the future of the Empire. But it wasn't a victory that felt sweet, at least not yet. It was a victory stained by sacrifice, by the cost of so many lives. Ethan ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble that had grown during the mission. His eyes were red from exhaustion, but there was a glimmer of something else there too, something that hadn't been present before. Hope. The crew of Pride of Earth had survived. They had done the impossible, but they had also left behind a trail of death and destruction. Sam, the chief engineer, was in the engine room, making sure their escape route was clear. Lieutenant Carver, his right hand, was pacing behind him, her eyes never far from the view of the Zalorh fleet in their wake. Her brow was furrowed, lips tight, as if she were still expecting the other shoe to drop. "Captain," she spoke softly, her voice carrying over the quiet hum of the ship. "We made it. But what happens now? The Zalorh might be down, but they're not gone." Ethan glanced at her, a small, tired smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "What happens now is that we fight. We rebuild. We take back what they stole from us." Carver nodded, but the doubt in her eyes remained. "We can't do this alone, Ethan. The fleet we have left, it's barely enough to defend Pride." He turned away from her gaze, his mind already thinking ahead. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. The destruction of the planet killer had crippled the Zalorh's ability to annihilate Earth's colonies, but they were still a force to be reckoned with. The battle they had won was just one skirmish in a larger war. But it was a start, a beginning, and for the first time in years, that was enough. "We'll rally the rest of the survivors," Ethan said, his voice hardening with determination. "We'll get the message out. We've proven that we can hit them where it hurts. This isn't the end, Carver. It's the beginning of the end for them." Carver exhaled slowly, running her hand through her hair. "And if they come for us?" "If they come for us," Ethan said, turning back to her, "we'll be ready. We always have been." The silence between them stretched for a moment, the weight of the unspoken words settling in. Ethan knew what Carver was really asking. The war wasn't over. They had won one battle, but the fight was far from finished. The Zalorh would come. It was inevitable. And when they did, humanity would have to stand together or fall apart. "Captain," Sam's voice suddenly crackled over the comm. "We've got a situation." Ethan's heart skipped. "What is it?" "Looks like the Zalorh fleet wasn't as decimated as we thought," Sam's voice said, sounding tense. "We're picking up multiple ships on the edge of our radar. They've launched a pursuit. They're faster than we are." Ethan's jaw clenched. "How fast?" "They'll catch up in a few hours if we don't take evasive action. We can't outrun them, but we might be able to hide." Ethan didn't waste a second. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers. We're not giving up this victory so easily. Get us in a stealth mode, Sam, and send the message. Let the other colonies know we're still alive." As the ship shook under the pressure of the evasive maneuvers, Ethan moved swiftly through the command deck, his eyes scanning the hollow display. The Zalorh might have been crippled, but they weren't done yet. They were smart, relentless, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. The Pride was humanity's last hope, and it was up to them to carry the torch forward. "Do you really think the message will get through?" Carver asked quietly as she watched him move. "It has to," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "We've survived the worst. The people on Earth need to know that we're still here, that there's still hope." They both knew the truth. Hope had been in short supply for too long. The world they had known was gone, replaced by a brutal, relentless war. The human spirit had been pushed to the brink, tested in ways that no one could have ever imagined. But even in the darkest moments, humanity had refused to break. They had fought back, time and time again, against impossible odds. Ethan looked at Carver. "We're not just fighting for survival anymore. We're fighting for something bigger than ourselves. We're fighting for a future. And no matter how hard they push, we will keep fighting." Carver's expression softened, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like forever. "You're right. she said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. We fight for the future. For everyone we've lost. Ethan nodded, his eyes flicking to the holomap once more. We fight because we have no choice. As the Pride of Earth continued to evade pursuit, the crew fell into their roles with a renewed sense of purpose. The situation was dire, but they had one thing that no alien force could ever take from them: their will to survive, their unity, and the promise that they would keep fighting no matter what it took. Hours passed in tense silence as Sam worked to keep the ship hidden, maneuvering through the asteroid fields and nebulae. The Pride was invisible to the Zalorh sensors, but they wouldn't be able to keep up the charade forever. Ethan stood at the command deck, staring out at the stars, his mind filled with thoughts of the road ahead. The crew had done their part. The mission had been a success, but the war was far from over. There would be more battles, more sacrifices, but as long as there was breath in his lungs, he would keep leading. He would keep fighting for Earth, for humanity's future. And so, as the stars stretched out before him, Ethan allowed himself a brief moment of peace, a fleeting, fragile thing, but one that he knew would carry him through the next battle. Send the signal, Ethan said quietly to Carver. Let them know we're coming. We're not done yet. The message was sent, and with it, a spark of hope was ignited across the galaxy. Earth's fight for survival was far from over, but now, for the first time in years, they had a real chance at victory. And that was enough.